Velina Tchakarova, geopolitical expert and founder of FACE. It's a great pleasure to have you with us here at Marhelm.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for having me on your show.
And could we maybe start off by introducing you a little bit? Could you tell us a bit about your background and how you got to where you are now?
Since 2023, I founded a geopolitical consultant. So it's a very small geopolitical consultancy based in Vienna, Austria. Previously, I've been actually specialized in the field of security and defense, and obviously geopolitics. So my background is mostly linked to these specific fields.
You've become an increasingly known geopolitical analyst recently, and maybe you can remind us what's been your biggest hit and your biggest miss so far in terms of forecasting.
Probably most prominent scenarios that I've been pointing to since 2015 was the bifurcation of the global system, because this was a time when most analysts were pointing to a new multipolarity, to, let's say, many centers of power, contrary to the unipolar moment of the international relations under the guidance of the United States. And I, argued that the trend projections, because you draw on different scenarios, but in the end, you have to also make an assessment as to which of these possible future scenarios would be the most plausible one, not just possible and probable, but also plausible to happen, because that's, of course, probably the most difficult task. And the bifurcation was such, example. The other one, derived from my strategic foresight in the world of geopolitics and geoeconomics, was about the dragon bear, which I was also propagating for almost 10 years now. And now we have, of course, a very, very clear picture how this dragon bear, as a modus vivendi of systemic coordination between China and Russia, really looks like. Now we have many proofs from the reality over the last 2 years, and I can touch upon it a little bit later. And just to give you another example, my assessment for the plausibility of a beginning of a war by Russia on Ukraine, this assessment was made in December 2021, when we saw the largest, the biggest in terms of scale and scope military escalation on the borders of Ukraine. And so I did this assessment based again on the trend projections and the ongoing, of course, developments. And in my assessment, I saw a clear beginning of the war after February 20. I said that it will be actually named a special military operation, and it will be conducted in the south and the east of Ukraine, because in my assessment, I saw the subjugation effort on behalf of Russia as a time frame of around 8 to 10 years. Why? Because the Russian President Putin was already, making it clear that he intends to rule for the next 2 mandates. So you take this time frame as well, and you see how this subjugation would be tried and applied and launched in terms of military operations in a longer period of time. So obviously I was wrong, because it was an all-in war from 5 directions. So it was a big, of course, deviation from my assessment. Another, probably because you asked me about also assessments where I was wrong, was last year, when actually the mutiny of Prigozhin, took place in Russia. Prigozhin being in the lead of the state-funded mercenary group Wagner PMC, which meanwhile has been rebranded to another very much linked to Nazi symbolism, as it is with the case of the previous name. African Corps is now the new brand of this mercenary group, and I argued that the whole operation of Prigozhin, and we don't have the time now, of course, to explain all the details, has been more or less staged in a sense that at that time we did not have the information, and we received it later, that it has been a state enterprise to the fullest extent. That means Russia operating on the ground of, let's say, Africa or Middle East through a proxy, which was Wagner. And also what we did not know up until then, but we had the speculation, was that Prigozhin was absolutely part of this very close circle around Putin in, the St. Petersburg, the famous St. Petersburg circle, which, of course, after the airplane crash, and when his death was confirmed, and the whole leadership of Wagner was confirmed dead by the Russian, president, we found out that this partnership goes back to the beginning of the 90s, which was also the beginning of the career of the Russian president as a politician. So all in all, as I highlighted, the assessment is very much long-term oriented. In this particular last case I gave you, I said that Wagner won't be dissolved, that the state will further, operate on the ground via such proxy, as we are now seeing in the reality. And it was very interesting most recently to read an interview with the head of the military intelligence of Ukraine, Kirill Budanov, who actually, it was just last month, who actually said that they still have zero clues as to whether Prigozhin was really in that plane, and as to whether Prigozhin really died. So that's on my side.
Great. Let's dig into what you mentioned, the great bifurcation, and let's start with the big picture. Where is the world headed at this point?
So right now, as we speak, the world is really at a pivotal moment. Like, I know it's very kind of cliche, we are at the inflection point, pivotal moment, but it's really, I mean, I don't think that most of the companies and institutions and organizations really understand the criticality of this transitionary period in the international relations. We are in a period facing the highest number of military conflicts since the end of the Cold War. We are in a period which, I mean, obviously points also to the emergence of a lot of hotspots, and that gives us the impression, this is the reason why a lot of people have this real fear of facing a World War III. Because there are so many, conventional wars, and obviously also proxy wars. But I argue that all of these events and developments are actually signals, strong signals, then point to this systemic process of bifurcation of the global system. Now we need to first and foremost understand what a global system is, right? I mean, when we say international relations, when we say global affairs, we think of a globalized world. But if you go back to the history, you will find other examples of globalization. I mean, 4,000 years ago, there were global powers which had an idea how to globalize on their terms. Think of the Silk Road, and I was traveling the Silk Road last year, and you see, I mean, how people are connected, how trade hubs are connected. So this very idea is not new. But what happened really, what was really unique from the last 30 years was the way how globalization was conducted. It was unique because of the scope and the scale of globalization under the guidance of obviously a sole state actor with global power projections. As we speak, the United States is still the only actor with such global power projection capabilities. And because of that, and because also of the fact that most of the trade is maritime trade is conducted via maritime routes, we saw this biggest scale of globalization. And the result, the outcome of it was that most of the countries in the world became part of something new, and that is this global capitalist system. You know, now if something happens even in a small country which has certain exposure or certain leverage, it could bring about waves somewhere else based on this butterfly effect, or what we saw very clearly and felt very strongly with the global financial and later on economic crisis. So you already understand what the point is. The point is that different systems within the international relations, be it financial system, be it monetary system, markets, so capital markets, agriculture, energy, trade, economy, and so on and so forth, and of course all of it facilitated by supply chains, which are the bloodlines of this global system. So all of them merged into something bigger. That is bigger, so the whole is bigger than the sum of its parts. And because of it, we now see how wars and pandemics, being this, systemic risks, such as the one that happened with the too big to fail banks, that they have contagion effects. That if something happens linked to a pandemic of global scale, or if we have like the biggest war taking place, for instance, on the old continent, or like now the most severe military conflict taking place in the Middle East, or now the most also significant crisis taking place in the Red Sea, all of this is interconnected, and it is interconnected to the top. And at the top, now we see that it is being split into two major parts. One that's being facilitated, controlled, and influenced by the United States, and the other part is being facilitated, controlled, and influenced by China.
Let's be a bit more specific. I mean, this great bifurcation, which we've been discussing, what are the main, if you look at shipping, energy, the global economy, what are the main consequences of such a bifurcation?
So the main consequences are as follows. First, it is a Cold War 2.0 between the United States on the one hand and China and Russia on the other. So the first thesis I have is that Russia has sided with China, and it has built this modus vivendi of coordination with China in various domains, including, by the way, also the domain of supply chains, and I can explain a little bit into detail later. And under this under the framework of a Cold War 2.0, where there is no incentive for direct military confrontation between three systemic players and between three nuclear powers, everything else is being weaponized, including, of course, trade routes, supply chains, and transport corridors. So on the one hand, the United States, as the sole guarantor for the security and stability of these global supply chains, is being challenged. They are being challenged in their credibility to provide for the security, but they are also being pushed away for certain, important passages. Because if you take a look at the map, and if you see how the structure of these trade routes looks like, you find spots on the map that are influenced by geography. They are influenced, for instance, by technical issues, such as it's a let's say a spot that if it's blocked, the deviation alternatives are much more expensive, take much more time, and so on and so forth. And we saw such a scenario a few years ago with the incident of the Suez Canal. So it doesn't have to be necessarily linked only to geopolitics, could be linked to climate related issues. It could be linked also to, let's say, technical issues. But meanwhile, it is increasingly being linked also to geopolitics, where the ground is being tested of, let's say, on the one hand, the American control over these global choke points, and on the other hand, you know, using it as exposure for the sake of its of the own interests, like it is the case with China and with Russia. So if we take a little bit, if we dive a little bit into this, you know, picture of this big picture, as you said, right now you take a look at the three most important terrains of competition. And you see that the powers are aligned when it comes to the war, or the ongoing war on Ukraine. So United States is supporting Ukraine together with the European powers, so the so-called West. China is supporting Russia. Then you move to the Middle East and you see that the ongoing conflict, once again, the West is supporting Israel. And China and Russia are pressing for ceasefire, are pressuring actually for the support of the Palestinian people. And then you move to the ongoing crisis in the Red Sea, and once again you see that the West is trying, and here we have mostly right now the US and UK trying to restore the operations. That means the freedom of navigation in through Bab el-Mandeb, which is the one critical choke point, and by extension to restore also the traffic in the Suez Canal, which is suffering because of the actions of the Iran backed Houthi in Yemen. But at the same time, you see that actually the Chinese ships and Russian tankers are not operating under the same constraints. And I will move one step further by saying that what we are about to see as next step is that most likely China and Russia will open a third geopolitical front in the Indo-Pacific, in the South China Sea, where once again we have critical passages, South China Sea being linked to the rest of the Indian Ocean, and then, connecting this most significant maritime route that goes through, the Gulf of Aden and the Suez Canal, and as I said, Bab el-Mandeb. But in the other direction, it goes also through the Strait of Malacca and to the Strait, into the Strait of Taiwan. So once again, it's a critical exposure where military escalations have been ongoing since quite some time now, and I argue now with the opening of a second terrain with North Korea. So North Korea has been activated via different channels, political, diplomatic channels, and the transfer of, let's say, military technology. You see how actually every possible ground is being used for this Cold War competition and confrontation between these three critical players.
Let's dig a bit more into the Red Sea conflict, which you already touched upon. And should we see the Red Sea conflict as a battle over who gets to set the terms for global trade?
Absolutely, 100%. The timing is not coincidental. Of course, the more plausible explanation is that Iran used the opportunity of activating its proxies in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and also in Yemen to create problems for the United States, knowing very well that the Biden administration would be reluctant to get involved in any kind of military confrontation in this region and beyond in a presidential election year. So, in a sense, Iran, using this context that I outlined shortly for you, is trying to maximize its own gains. But it goes a step further, because now it clearly shows also the broader picture. But in order for me to show you the broader picture, I need to make few steps backwards, by explaining that before the 7th of October, before actually the terrorist attack of Hamas on Israeli civilians, this was probably one of the most optimistic geopolitical contexts in the whole region, given the fact that there has been a normalization process between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which, by the way, resulted in ceasefire in Yemen. So the activities of the Houthi were put on hold, and this happened under the umbrella of Chinese mediation. And at the same time, there was a more or less simultaneous process of, it was again a chain reaction, obviously, that pushed the Americans to do more on the ground, where under the guidance of the United States, Saudi Arabia and Israel were also negotiating about normalization process. And it entailed, among other things, also the two-state solution for the Palestinian people. So in fact, most of the regional actors on the ground were not inclined into to having any kind of confrontation with each other. On the opposite, they were interested in actually normalizing the relationship and moving mostly, of course, between the Arab countries and Israel, but also between the two, key rivals, Saudi Arabia and Iran. And in a sense, this geopolitical context was very promising in terms of deals, in terms of new trade corridors, new supply chains, that goes in all possible directions, supply chain and corridors linking to India, linking to China, linking to Russia, linking to Europe and to an African continent. And the only actor that had actually something against all of this developments was Hamas, because they feared that they would be completely turned irrelevant, geopolitically irrelevant. So going back now to the current developments, I don't see any strong signals that point to an incentive on behalf of Iran or on behalf of the United States to get involved into a direct military clash. And the same goes for the other actors. So there is a very, very big restraint, even though that, of course, the situation as it is right now is probably the most devastating situation compared to all previous, military crises and conflicts in the region. And it will obviously take a longer time. But against this background, of course, there are a lot of opportunities for these players to capitalize on what I described as a systemic context, namely that knowing this realities of the systemic competition, knowing that the decoupling of between United States and China is more or less an irreversible process, and is being pushed by both sides. Knowing of this critical modus vivendi between China and Russia, understanding that the positions are now so detrimentally opposed that there is a lot of gray area in between that can be used. This is what is happening right now. The existent networks are being tested. And like we are seeing in the Red Sea, are also, they're using cheap technologies. They're using cheap drones to actually inflict a significant geoeconomic pain and hit the credibility of the United States, to the point that some analysts even discuss the possibility of a black swan event, which could be that the United States at some point of time in the future may actually render it unimportant to continue securing this supply line, because from an American point of view, it is more about the credibility than about the shipping of its own let's say goods, because the Americans have also the Atlantic basin, and they can actually reroute, and they are having a lot of other alternatives and opportunities. But what I find most striking is that if we take this possible black swan event into consideration, then we could safely assume that the Europeans, which are mostly affected, are in a complete geopolitical stupor, not being able to do anything against it.
Interesting. Who do you think will be the winner of this Red Sea conflict?
Right now, as of as of today, let's say the way how actually the conflict is being shaped and is developing, the biggest winners are obviously on behalf of China and Russia, because they I mean, we are already getting data and we see that the Russian tankers and we have a very, very big portion of the so-called shadow fleet of Russia, which has been operating over the last 2 years, shipping mostly, sanctioned fossil fuels, the oil. But also, if you take a look at the Chinese, I mean, for the Chinese, it's enough to put a flag with the Chinese only crew. And then the risk is significantly reduced that such a ship will be attacked. I mean, the Houthi even made political statements claiming that they would not attack Russian and Chinese ships. And so you clearly see that there is a siding in this crisis. It is so that the Chinese had invested political capital in Yemen. That means that they had already the political contacts on the ground, and they also have a very, very strong and solid relationship with Iran, which is an additional, let's say, beneficial factor for them, because they can also use this card if they, let's say, want to achieve something. So in the sense, the way it goes right now, I mean, the Americans and the British obviously do not really have a big success in the operation. And as I said, the relation between the drones being used by the Houthi and actually the very, very expensive missiles being used by the Americans and the British is it's quite questionable. I mean, the efficiency of this operation is still not visible. And I will argue that even looking from this perspective, not just, the blockade itself, which is already having an inflationary impact, as I said, in an election year in both Europe and United States. I mean, this always good news for, from the perspective of Russia or from the perspective of China. China dealing with its own problems at home is certainly happy to see that, the Americans are kept busy somewhere else and are not necessarily getting more directly involved in the Indo-Pacific and specifically in the South China Sea.
Yeah. So from a shipping investor perspective, we've seen that rates have risen for many of the shipping segments, containers, tankers, and also dry bulk to some extent. And then on the other hand, we have you saying that it's looking rather bleak for the Americans or the Allied in the Red Sea, and you've also talked about a reconfiguration of supply chains, and you talked about competing transport corridors. So my next question would be, how does all this connect? I mean, how are we going to see this reconfiguration, and what effect do you think this will have, for example, on transport distances, transport routes?
So the reconfiguration of the global supply chains has actually started already with the pandemic. I mean, the global pandemic, and at that time, many analysts were actually suspicious about this thesis, because we've seen in the past that global supply chains could, go back to their normal state after a big, let's say, event, whether it's linked to natural catastrophe, or we saw it, for instance, with Fukushima. I mean, following the Fukushima, when we had a very, very big, let's say, regional effect on supply chains. But in this case, my argument and my main thesis was a different one, and that is, like I said, that most people neglect the reality that pandemics, and next to it, we saw also with the war, that major wars and pandemics have, showed the characteristics of systemic risks. And that means, of course, that systemic risks, as we saw it with the great, financial crisis, have this ability to unleash events of second and third order. That means one event has a contagion effect on, next event, which we cannot predict in advance. Then it has a contagion effect on a third event, and this goes, further to the point that we see a lot of cascading effects. And this is where we are. This is what I mean with the reconfiguration that started with the pandemic, but in fact was politically also pushed forward by the decoupling, because the decoupling was wrongly assumed to be a policy of the United States. Starting already with Obama, when Obama was testing the ground of how to actually engage with allies and partners through institutionalized platforms to create like a geo-economic counterweight to the growing, economic might of China at the time. And then we saw what happened with Trump, who had a very different idea of direct confrontation, mostly, of course, in the field of economy, trade, and that obviously also affected supply chains. But with the pandemic being a systemic risk, and then with the launch of Russia's war against Ukraine, which is also systemic risk, we reached a point in which this reconfiguration, that means supply chains will see a similar process of bifurcation in which countries like China and Russia will pursue alternative routes which are not controlled by the United States. This is simply put. And at the same time, of course, the United States with partners, be it in the Indo-Pacific region, for instance, there we saw a reconfiguration centered around 4 countries, South Korea, Japan, Australia, India. And this reconfiguration was, for instance, about supply chains in the field of chips. Then, of course, it was a reconfiguration in terms of how to create supply chains in terms of vaccines and in terms of vaccines production for the future. And then, of course, other, issues like trade and technology council, because we are also in the middle of a 4th industrial revolution. And here, every critical sector that would enable technological breakthroughs would be absolutely, of an absolute importance from state perspective. So the reconfiguration is now in the next stage, and the next stage would be to observe where these alternatives could be, because if you look at the map, you see that it's the same. It's about the same choke points when it comes to food and when it comes to oil, supply in the world. So you have like almost complete overlapping of the most critical passages that see obviously also the biggest traffic of oil and also food like grain commodities. And this means also that it's not easy. It cannot happen over a year that we see alternatives. Where could these alternatives lie? For instance, in the case of China, one alternative has been launched by creating supply chains via terrestrial corridors instead of maritime corridors. Now, we may argue that they are not so efficient as the maritime corridors. They are more prone to, let's say, terrorist activities, like it is the case in China, which has been, for instance, eager to build an economic corridor in Pakistan. And we saw that during the construction of this economic corridor, there were terrorist attacks on Chinese workers in some Pakistani provinces like Balochistan. But obviously this network of terrestrial corridors, like the two in Myanmar and in Pakistan, which connect China to the Indian Ocean and give an alternative in the case that, let's see, we have a situation in which the supply of critical commodities, China is energy deprived. China very much relies on actually on the import of such critical commodities. And let's assume that the maritime corridor that I've been talking about is under certain blockage for whatever reasons in the future. We see how China is making sure that it has also alternatives, such as the Eurasian terrestrial corridor. But what's more interesting is that, and that's my other thesis, is that China is trying to actually create a maritime corridor together with Russia in the Arctic because of the climate related changes. Now this corridor in the Arctic, the Northern Sea Route, is going to be available for longer period of time. And Russia has invested a lot in militarization of, of along the coastal littorals, and also has been investing a lot in terms of preparing for this, for this period when it will be needed to, to have icebreakers. You will need to have the facilitation of ports, the infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And China on its own is not an Arctic nation. So the only entry ticket that China has in order to be more present there and to use this possible future supply chain that will shorten the shipping extensively, and at the same time will give an opportunity to not rely on US controlled maritime route. So having these two aspects in mind, I think that what we may see very soon in the making is to have this alternative Northern Sea route as, let's say, as a possibility, coupled with the Eurasian, connectivity that has been built over the last 10 years within the so-called Belt and Road initiative, which has many deviations, but we obviously have to pay attention mostly to the one connecting with the Central Asian countries because of, once again, the commodities, with Russia, of course, and then with Turkey and Afghanistan, Iran. From there, of course, going through Europe and Africa, and moving even towards Latin America. But from the American point of view, we also have been observing similar steps towards more self-reliance and creating alternative supply chains, for instance, with direct neighbors such as Mexico or Canada, which I think already points also to the similar trend projection of the alternative center of geoeconomic power with its own structure that excludes China to a great extent.
Just a quick follow-up on the trade routes. So you're saying that we would be likely to see the development of the Arctic trade route, but if this conflict in the Red Sea goes on and we find out that actually the allies are not in control of the traditional transport routes anyway, so why would there be a change? Why won't we just see the old routes continuing, but maybe under the control of new superpowers, let's say Russia and China, for example? Why wouldn't we see that?
You mean the control of the Red Sea under new powers?
Yeah, so I'm saying that you're talking about the Arctic trade route as a likely alternative in the next years, but we also discussed that the Allied situation in the Red Sea conflict is not looking very good. So why couldn't it be that we have a victory of, say, China and Russia in the Red Sea conflict, and we will just continue with the traditional trade routes, but now under the control of new powers, let's say?
Because I think that the Red Sea is being used as a leverage, as I try to explain right now. It's just that key players are trying to capitalize and use it as a leverage. Here, the dependence, for instance, from Europe's perspective on this route is so so great that yes, of course, we saw the alternatives with let's say using the much longer and obviously very costly solution of South Africa to deviate the shipping. But in the end, I think that obviously from Russia's point of view, the possibility to use it as a leverage, for instance, in future negotiations, where they can offer, let's say, a solution in this particular part of the world, which is very important, as I said, for the Europeans. In return, they could actually pressure the Europeans to, for instance, to agree on another issue, which is, in my view, the ongoing war in Ukraine, where Russia will seek some kind of political solution, at least in terms of ceasefire or in terms of negotiations, in order to legitimize the victory over the territory that it controls right now. It's around 17% of the territory of Ukraine, and they can use actually their leverage somewhere else. From China's point of view, it goes the same way, because China still has a very strong interest in having, for instance, trade, with the Europeans, and it still has also a significant trade volume with the United States. So it's not like we are in an alternative world already. I mean, we are absolutely in between. This in between could last for decades. We do not know exactly the outcome of, let's say, a decoupling between the two biggest economies in the world, because we've never had this before. It's a phenomenon. We are dealing right now with so many phenomenons that are, the first, that we have no idea about the exact outcome. And what I try to say is that it is really more about testing the ground and trying to derive some short-term gains, and trying to hedge, trying to balance, and trying to leverage, rather than have an ultimate, so to say, outcome in one specific situation, as it is the situation in the Red Sea. And from the moment when we will see, and I think that by late spring, we will see probably the first window of opportunity for a ceasefire and some sort of first negotiations and solution in the Middle East. This is going to have a chain reaction, positive chain reaction, also on the events, for instance, in the Red Sea. But from the downside perspective, what we need to pay attention is that sometimes intentions lead to unpredictable outcomes. Here, for instance, what is right now very worrisome is the situation in Egypt, which is not linked to the direct, intention of a country like Russia or China or United States that want to interfere with the political dynamics, but because of the impact from not one, not two, but three different crises, they have this negative effect on Egypt. The Black Sea blockage from 2022 had a negative effect on Egypt because it's dependent on the commodities, the food commodities. Then we saw with the Middle East, and now with the crisis in the Red Sea, we see these unanticipated effects on some of the countries. And this is something that nobody can predict exactly how it will, how it will look like in reality, how it will, turn in the real world. But to wrap it up, I don't think that here it really it is about a final outcome being pursued by one of the key players. It's more really about how to put this puzzle piece on the big table and try to move pieces depending on the ad hoc situation, and also depending on the long-term goals, which I try to somehow outline for you in a very, very short, of course, format.
Great. Let's move on to the energy side, which we haven't covered that much so far. And how do you see this ongoing confrontation affecting the oil market?
Well, in fact, it's interesting because well, if you take a look at strictly at the numbers, it did not show the anticipated negative effect that many were pointing to. The oil is still moving actually at price levels that are even lower, compared to the levels where oil was around 90 when the crisis in the Red Sea began. So here, I mean, the question is, of course, what kind of event has to happen to unleash this kind of panic level on the market, so that we see a significant change in terms of pricing. And I don't have answer to this question, but what I find really interesting is actually the question about how this inflationary impact that's being unleashed by the reconfiguration of the supply chains in general, because this is my main thesis. I mean, the reconfiguration is here to stay. It's an irreversible process, and it's going to last for very, very long time, because it takes really decades first to build supply chains, not to speak of reconfigure. And of course, in some cases, we will see big successes in the short term because of because of geography. Like I gave the example with Mexico and United States. We have such cases, but in general, to have a fully facilitated new supply chain, it will take 10, 15, 20 years probably in some cases. So what I find interesting in this case, when we talk about oil and pricing, is how this inflationary impact that's going to continue despite all the policies coming from the central banks is going to affect actually the energy sector in the long run. And I argue that we will have the inflationary impact even in a situation where, as many want to convince us, we are going to enter context of, let's say, peak oil, or at some point of time in the future, even peak gas, which I just don't buy, of course, because we see how some parts of the world are going to undergo a similar growth trajectory, economic growth trajectory, and this goes in the direction of the Southeast Asia. It goes in the direction of South Asia, where we have India now being en route to become world's economic power number 3, and some other parts of the world which will still be very much dependent on the fossil fuels. So against this background, I don't see this pessimistic, for instance, forecast as really convincing that we will see less oil and less gas on the market, because the alternatives right now, as they are not enough to service this kind of thesis of immense, huge economic growth happening there. And even in the case of China, with all what happened from last year up until now, with all the problems, with all the domestic troubles, again, I mean, the picture clearly shows that once again, I mean, the demand for fossil fuels is here to stay. So all in all, if we assume that oil production is on a route to reduction because of political constraints, this is the case, for instance, in in the West, because of the whole decarbonization thesis and decision, by the way, then once again, we have to ask ourselves the question in a context where significant technological breakthrough is still missing. And I mean technological breakthrough, I don't care whether it's in the field of renewables or in the field of nuclear energy, but whatever kind of technological breakthrough that ensures cheap, efficient, affordable, and accessible energy source for all these energy-hungry economies, We are not in this context, so that means in my case I'm quite bullish. I'm still quite bullish on actually the development of you know, of the oil price, and yeah, and obviously also even more so when it comes to the gas demand.
Excellent. That takes me. I mean, we are actually past the time set. Do I have time to ask you 2 more questions?
Yes, go ahead.
Great. So that takes us perfectly over to my next question, which is the LNG market, and how do you see, from a geopolitical point of view, how do you see the future of LNG with all the things going on right now?
I'm very, very bullish on LNG. I think that LNG is going to witness a kind of renaissance, if you like a very, very, it's a very interesting period for LNG, also from geopolitical point of view. If you take a look at, for instance, you know, the situation in some of the key suppliers, for instance, because of the lack of diversification in terms of pipelines, Russia is going to, you know, refocus on LNG and is going to try to compensate for the lack of gas supply to Europe with LNG supply with the rest of the world. Then, of course, we have very, very, you know, successful story with coming from the United States. I mean, United States is on the way of becoming one of the greatest combined oil and gas exporters. And think what kind of geopolitical ramifications this process will have on international relations. If you go back to the history of the Cold War and see how, you know, the fact that at that time United States was so dependent on supply from certain parts of the world, such was the case with the Middle East, how this actually had affected you know, the policy of America with certain states, as it was the case with Saudi Arabia and Iran, which were both the strategic pillars of the American Middle East policy for a long, long time before actually then the relationship with Iran went south at the end of the 70s. So going back to nowadays, this gives the United States an immense leverage in terms of first, you know, shaping its own foreign security and defense policy, then shaping the partnerships with critical partners and allies. In this case, Europe is now switching its dependence on you know, on Russia towards a dependence on LNG supply from United States. And with the crisis that's ongoing in the Red Sea, this dependence, we can safely assume, is going to further grow. In reality, the whole network between the 2 sides of the Atlantic, I mean, the transport network is going to further be facilitated because of this demand and because of these realities. And then again, of course, we have the rest of the world, which is, as I outlined, not less important, but on the opposite, more important, because the most you know, demographic growth and the most economic growth is going to happen in this part of the world, Southeast Asia, coupled with South Asia. And here, once again, you get the idea. We have critical, you know, suppliers of LNG in this part of the world. So once again, there will be a great opportunity. And if we look at the map and split it once again in 2, in this case, we have practically already the thesis of, let's say, West bound supply and then Asia bound supply.
Excellent. Last question, following up a bit on what you said about the decoupling. So you're saying that this is something unseen. We haven't seen this before, and it looks a bit like you know, you see different things going on at the same time. At once, on the one hand, you see the decoupling, as you say. On the other hand, you also see that these players depend on each other still on markets and for supplies. I mean, if you look at the trade route between the US in terms of energy, LNG, LPG, if we look at the car exports from China, I mean, the West is still half of their market. So I'm wondering if you can go a bit more into this decoupling process, and who's winning this race, and also if you can especially go into Latin America, because Latin America has been pointed out as a potential winner of this process. So if you can go a bit into those aspects of it.
Well, first I want to stress that yes, there will be winners, but in fact the world is not a winner if it's going to be split in two. Like obviously this is suboptimal for the international relations to have this kind of really comprehensive systemic process of splitting so many intertwined networks, socioeconomic networks that have been working quite well for such a long period and have enabled such a amazing economic growth for so many, that have uplifted so many people from being very, very poor. So that's the first thing I want to say. So in a sense, the world is not a winner from this kind of Cold War 2.0. And in reality, there is a prospect that at some point of time in the future, we may see a block of countries that will try to somehow create a counterweight to this phenomenon, to actually slow down the phenomenon, like countries, how we saw it happening during the Cold War with the non-alignment movement, once again tried to somehow create a bridge between the two worlds. And a possible leader of this kind of future bloc could be India, because India, as you see, is currently operating in both worlds. On the one hand, India is trying to, capitalize on its relationship with the West. Is one of probably the clear examples of a winner, if you like, if we shall focus on winners. Is obviously one of the clear winners of the reconfiguration of the global supply chains. A lot of capital has been rerouted from China towards India. Cheap production has started now in India with American capital, with domestic investment, and also with partnerships with third countries. And at the same time, India is has invested in a very, very long-term strategic partnership with Russia, and this partnership hasn't been disrupted because of the war on Ukraine. On the opposite, a lot of fossil fuels, a lot of oil, went to India. A lot of petroleum products went to Europe via India. And similarly, China capitalized immensely also on, the Russian fossil fuels during this period, the last 2 years. Here, despite the rivalry between China and India, India managed the relationship by participating in various regional formats, including the most significant one right now, which is the BRICS Plus format, which is a format between Brazil, Russia, China, India, and South Africa, now including 5 more countries, and is turning into some kind of commodities powerhouse because it includes oil and food exporters. And in a sense, you see how, despite being a winner in the strategy, in the stance of India, it is more about connections with both worlds. It is more about bridging the two worlds. It is more about how to make sure that these two worlds still kind of, stay together to some extent, at least. But of course, in other cases, we also see, let's say, strategies to capitalize on the reconfiguration, which are more nation related, like depending again on geography, or depending on access to critical raw materials. And you mentioned Latin America. So in Latin America and in Central America, you have such examples where obviously now the interest on behalf of the United States has been growing to diversify away from China. So you look for closer relationships, and you start actually rerouting a lot of capital. At the same time, you have certain conditions that allow you to do so, for instance, labor costs. And you have, let's say, the a proximity, but you still lack the infrastructure. So you start building the infrastructure. And such a clear example from the last 2 years has been Mexico, which now actually became the biggest, so to say, trading partner of the United States, surpassing China to some extent. So at the same time, we are in the middle of a fourth industrial revolution, and actually I argue that the winner of the fourth industrial revolution will be actually the power that will be able to impose the new rules of the game, including supply chains. So this power, will it be the United States again, or will it be China this time? We don't know for a fact. What we know is that they won't compete individually. They will compete in groups, because none of them is able to, win over the other on its own. And because of the fourth industrial revolution, because of the fact that we are in the middle of digital revolution, energy transition, and all of these other technological transformations happening simultaneously, here once again we see how both United States and China are striving to find partners on the ground that enable and offer the access to critical raw materials. And in Latin America, if you take a look at the continent, you see plenty of such opportunities. You have countries that have access to critical raw materials, such as for instance lithium or copper. Like the copper, for instance, is the example of Chile. Lithium, of course, also very, very important. You have, for instance, a lot of share coming from Latin American countries, on top of which is Bolivia. You have also other important metals and raw materials. You have also food commodities, like Brazil is a very, very important exporter. And the next G20 summit is going to take place this year in Brazil. So once again, you see how Latin America is, setting the stage also for a lot of activities and a lot of developments happening simultaneously. So it is not surprising that China has invested a lot in political relations and in the access and investment based on the logic of the Belt and Road Initiative kind of overstretching strategy. But at the same time, it is also not surprising that the United States have taken a proactive stance now and are going to try to get engaged with increasingly, more countries on the ground. But it's going to be difficult also because of ideology. You see how specifically Latin America is a is a place that has seen in the past so much happening in the political life based on a right-wing or left-wing ideology. And once again, we see how polarized this place is. And I think that this is also going to be decisive for the future aligning with one or with the other systemic competitor.
Velina Tchakarova, it was a pleasure to sit down with you today and discuss this topic.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the patience, and thank you for having me.